What happened? Hey guys, and welcome back to We Know Wonders. So I'm filming in a different spot of the apartment today because we live in the Philippine Islands and it's just too hot to film with direct sunlight right on my face. Okay, so today we are going to be doing my June reading wrap-up and I'm really excited to talk about these books. In the month of June, I read a total of 4 books and I'm really happy with them. I think they were all very interesting reads. They're the kinds of books that you won't forget them soon, you know? So, okay, without further ado, let's talk about the books. The first book that I read this month was A Plea for Eros by Siri Hustvedt. And I realized that I had been saying the name of one of my favorite authors wrong for so long. And I thought that it was Hustvedt, but turns out it was Hustvedt. I watched one of her interviews and then I was like, hold up. Yes, Mina, you have been saying it wrong for years. So yeah, I read A Plea for Eros by Siri Hustvedt, and this is a collection of essays. The thing that I find the most striking about Siri Hustvedt's writing is that she doesn't just talk about experiences, or she doesn't just talk about literary things, or she doesn't even just talk about experiences in a literary way. And while there's nothing wrong with that, I feel like there are already a lot of writers who do that. The thing that I really enjoy about Siri's work is that she's able to talk about these experiences and frame them in different lights. For example, she has one essay that has a very simple premise, which is that there is a yonder space, or a place that's sort of in between certain experiences. So for example, she talks about how prior to moving to the city, she had lived in the Midwest. So I guess for us, that would sort of be like living in the province and then moving to the city later on. And she was talking about how the idea of home had sort of been displaced and kind of became a yonder place. And she also talks about certain things like living different lives when you're in different places and adapting like different identities when you're in different places. In particular, she cites Jacques Lacan. So for those of you guys who aren't familiar with psychology, Jacques Lacan was a psychologist, and the thing that he's most famous for is talking about the mirror stage, or the stage in everyone's life when you're a kid and you see yourself in the mirror for the first time and you're able to recognize for the first time that that is you and that you exist outside of your own perception of yourself. It sort of talks about how that othering of the self is crucial to surviving in these yonder states. So for example, you were to move to a place where you didn't know anyone and you could have people perceive you in a whole new way, then the fact that you understand that there is sort of a self of you perceived by other people outside of what you had perceived yourself to be, then that would sort of give you this thread of continuity throughout these different identities. My favorite essay in this book was the one entitled 9/11 1 Year After, and I guess the title kind of says it all in the sense that it is an essay about 9/11. Siri Hustvedt has lived in Brooklyn, New York for years with her husband, and when 9/11 happened, she sort of saw it happen live. And I think another thing that's very striking also about these personal essays is while they are personal, they also take on kind of a more objective tone. So for example, in this essay, I've read a lot of essays as well about 9/11 because that happened when I was 11 years old, and at the time, like, my parents would read the newspaper and also make me read the newspaper, so I remember reading a lot about it. And of course, I think the knee-jerk reaction is kind of to talk about what you went through at that time, but the thing that I really found refreshing about this essay of Siri's is that she didn't just talk about her own experience, she also talks about the experience of her sister who was living in Manhattan at the time. So she saw it happen up close, whereas Siri was living in Brooklyn, and so she saw it from beyond the Brooklyn Bridge. And then later on, she sort of zooms out and talks about how it was also different to see that scene replayed over and over again on TV afterward, and how that almost created a separate memory as an object. And how when we see something on a screen, it sort of makes us treat that less as an experience and more as something to be objectified, commodified, something that like a media outlet can sell. All of these essays in Plea for Eros were written in the late 90s to the mid 2000s, and I guess something that I was thinking about while reading these essays is how would these translate to modern day themes, modern day situations. For example, Lacan's mirror stage. What does that look like now? Or what will it look like to the kids who are growing up, sort of experiencing that not through mirrors, but through lenses, through phone screens, tablet screens, and just there's sort of that layer of interactiveness, I guess, that wasn't there with the mirror. And I wonder how that's going to change the kind of people that they're going to be, how it's going to change their psyche. And just talking about screens and commodification, what is that like now that we've turned pretty much all of our experiences into something to be commodified? So I love going to concerts, and something that I've noticed at concerts is there are probably only 2 or 3 people who are really enjoying the moment and not friggin' filming everything on their phones and just sort of adding this weird dissonance to it where you paid to be here live, but really what you paid for is the opportunity to stand there live and watch the concert through a screen that you will later on Instagram to death. And so what you're really paying for is content. Like, you're effectively paying to create content and say that you were at this event. The second book that I read this month was My Private Property by Mary Reufle. This was recommended to me by my friend Hustvedt, and I think Mary Reufle is such an interesting writer. I'd say that she writes in a genre that's between poetry and prose, and you guys have heard me talk about those kinds of genres before. I think I've talked about Lydia Davis, Maggie Nelson, but I think sort of the main difference is Mary Reufle has this humor that I don't think the other two have. Of course, I'm not saying that Lydia Davis can't be funny. I mean, like, she's plenty funny, but I guess Mary Reufle just has that like vicious bite that is very different and that I've not really seen before. So my favorite piece in this book is the piece that she wrote on menopause. I just found it so hilarious and so funny. So I will be reading you guys a little snippet from that right now. Here it goes. Pause by Mary Reufle. I recently came across an old cryologue that I kept during the month of April in 1998. C stands for the fact I cried. The number of C's represents the number of times I cried, and NC indicates that I did not cry on that day. The saddest thing is, I now find the cryologue very funny and laugh when I look at it. But when I kept it, I wanted to die. Literally to kill myself with an iron, a steaming hot, turned on iron. This was not depression, this was menopause. Reading this or any other thing ever written about menopause will not help you in any way, for how you respond to menopause is not up to you. It's up to your body, and though you believe now that you can control your body, such as your strength after all that yoga, you cannot. Of course, you may be lucky. I know a woman who experienced menopause in no way whatsoever, except that one day she realized it had been a couple of years since her last period, which indeed was her last. You hear a lot about hot flashes, but hot flashes are the least of it. Totally inconsequential in every way. You get as hot as a steam iron at odd moments, so what? The media would have you believe that hot flashes are the single most significant symptom toward which you should direct your attention and their products. But when I think about menopause, I don't think of hot flashes. I'm not there to talk about hot flashes, except to tell you that they do not cease even when you have completely gone through menopause. They become a part of your life the way your periods were. They are periodic, and after a while, you stop talking about them. No, I'm here to tell you that one woman, a woman who is the most undepressed, optimistic, upbeat person I know, awoke one morning and walked straight into her kitchen and grabbed a butcher's knife. She's a world-class cook, with the intent of driving it through her heart. That was menopause. If you take the time to peruse the annals of any 19th century asylum, as I have, you will discover that the cost of admittance for all women over 40 is listed as cessation of menses. Sometimes I saw the words change of life, which sounds like a euphemism, but isn't. In other words, you go crazy. When you go crazy, you don't have the slightest inclination to read anything Foucault ever wrote about culture and madness. It may be that you recall your 13th year on Earth. Menopause is adolescence all over again. Only you are an adult and have to go out into the world every day in ways you did not have to when you were in school. where you were surrounded by other adolescents, safe or relatively so in the asylum of junior high. You are a 13-year-old with the experience and daily life of a 45-year-old. You have on some days the desire to fuck a tree or a dog, whichever is closest. So it's so funny, and it was just, oh my gosh. I said that I was going to discuss books like in a way that was different and not just like, oh, I like this, oh, I like that. But I can genuinely say that I really, really enjoyed this book. And I think it sort of gave voice to certain things about women, like the unpretty parts of women that people don't really talk about and people don't want to talk about, because women are supposed to be, if anything else, like beautiful or attractive or whatever. So yeah, I really, really like that. After that, I read Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire, and reading this was like a wild ride. Okay, so here's the thing about Nabokov is that I find him very interesting as a person. And I always have admired him for his skill with language. I think Nabokov is one of the early modern lyrical writers in the sense that he really has sort of this way of making words flow, and even if it's prose, it sounds poetic. I think that that's really Nabokov's gift. So this book is strange because, okay, first let's talk about its structure. So the way that it's structured is that it's sort of a story within a story. So from the introduction, and I was fooled by this, so if you're going to read this, be mindful. From the introduction, this is sort of a fake book, or it's pretending to be a book called Pale Fire that was written by a fictional poet called John Shade. So John Shade is supposedly like a Nobel laureate type, or you know, sort of that trope of like an old, wizened, famous professor who somehow has an estate near Harvard or Princeton. And the entire first half is just what the book would have been. So I think it's sort of alluding to Ezra Pound's Cantos, where it's like this very long poem and it's divided into different cantos, and you kind of learn a little bit about John Shade, and you learn about his life, his daughter who he lost when she was at a young age, and sort of small tensions like that. But the real story begins later on, after the epic poem itself, and that is where you start to meet the protagonist. So the introduction is written by the protagonist, sort of telling you that this is going to be his commentary on his dear friend John Shade's last book, which was published posthumously. And then once you start reading the part which is the commentary, you start discovering things not just about John Shade, but also about the protagonist, Charles Kinbote. So I'm not going to give everything away, but he turns out to be a very important person. And the things that he writes about, on the surface, might seem like he's talking about John Shade and John Shade's poems, but really what he's talking about is himself. And he is sort of trying to read this poetry and find himself in the poems, find himself in what John Shade has written. Right, so, okay, first let's talk about the positives of this book. The language is beautiful, as I expect from Nabokov. The plot and like the form, I think, are very, very interesting. However, I think there is sort of an imbalance in what the plot sort of gives lip service to. So the thing is that I keep wondering, like, if the Pale Fire novel, I mean, like the Pale Fire book part was really necessary. Like, of course, I understand sort of the attraction of that conceit, where you think that you're talking about one thing, but turns out you're really talking about another thing. But at the same time, by the end of it, I sort of had forgotten like exactly what Pale Fire was about. Like, just, I mean, Pale Fire, like the poems. So yeah, I feel like it could have been anything, or it could have been something a little bit more interesting. All in all, an interesting read, and I'd say worth the effort of sort of plowing through it, because it isn't easy reading. Like, it's the kind of book where you really sort of have to pay attention to what's happening and who's who, and to sort of prove that, it also comes with an appendix of the characters, their aliases, certain loopholes, certain things. So yeah, for those of you guys who like mind games or who like books that are kind of like games, then you guys will definitely enjoy this. Last but not the least, I read a graphic novel. I read Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. And this was also recommended to me by my friend Austir. It's an autobiographical graphic novel, which I think belongs to this genre that I really enjoy, like fun home and blankets, and I don't know, there's something about that where it's like you get the perks of non-fiction, which I guess is that you are reading about someone's real life experience, but also you get some more like visual sensations kind of attached to that experience, which I really enjoy. So this book sort of takes us from when Marjane is a kid growing up in Iran all the way until she is in her mid-20s and decides to leave Iran for good. So the interesting thing about this book is that it's both deeply personal and also very political. And as someone who grew up in the Philippines, which I will tell you is like a conundrum all on its own, where on the one hand you're sort of living in political turmoil, but on the other hand you are sort of sheltered also by so many things, like number one by your parents, number two by the fact that there's always kind of this hesitation to act, I guess, or like this pressure to appear civilized, and I guess that's just post-colonialism for you. But yeah, it was sort of refreshing to see the way that she told the story of actively participating in a revolution. And what I found the most interesting was just how eloquent she was and how articulate she was about certain things that I feel like would sort of be glossed over in a different story. So for example, toward the start of the book, there is a ruler who is kind of a tyrant, and he's called the Shah. And the Shah has sort of been booted out by the middle of the story, but then the thing is, I feel like it's very tempting there to be like, oh, revolution solved everything, like everything's great now. But then that sort of paves the way for an even worse ruler to take his place. And I just think that that's something that a lot of people don't talk about, where I feel like it would have been a neater narrative, yes, but also it wouldn't have been, you know, a great narrative. And just to borrow from the movie, the half of it, it's like sometimes you have to give up something good, like to get something great. And so I think that this was really a great book. I loved how it was structured. I loved the artwork, like it was so cute. And I also like how there were just like points of it that were just meandering. Like it never felt like you wanted to get to the point too quickly, but when you did get to the point, you know, like you just kind of experienced the swell of heartbreak and really feeling for the characters. So yeah, I think that it was great structurally. I feel like the dialogue was super funny, the art was great, and all in all, it's a really good book. The only thing that I sort of have qualms with when it comes to this is that it does kind of frame leaving your home country as sort of as the end goal or the end solution, where everything you've sort of been building up to is to sort of leave this lost cause eventually. I understand that she sort of had to be faithful also to her experience, but also that's something that sits a little bit uncomfortably with me, just because also of my own experiences with diaspora and how that does seem to be the prevalent narrative even here in the Philippines, right? But of course, that's kind of a reading that I know shouldn't influence you guys too much, because that's coming from my own experience and also not really entirely to do with the book itself. So all in all, I really enjoyed that. Have you guys read these books? Please let me know if you have. If you haven't, did you like them? Did you not like them? Did you hate them with a vengeance? I just want to know, pick your brains. Please leave your comments in the comments part below. Yeah, that's it for now. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!